welcome to Gray Zone Longevity. It's my pleasure to be here with two wonderful scientists and friends that we're going to talk to about a really exciting topic today, which is basically lifestyle factors that are associated with very marked benefit, health and lifespan and disease risk. And before we get into that, I suppose I should introduce why we're here to begin with in the first place. This is a new series that Dr. Grant Fraser and I are starting called Gray Zone Longevity, really to address a need that we saw in the space. Grant is a practicing longevity physician. I'm a drug developer with a deep interest in health and longevity. There's a lot of great content coming out, but it doesn't always kind of get to the practical application piece that we think is really important. We both think we can do to add value to this space is take this wide breadth of amazing science that's coming out, these sometimes really complex and interesting clinical and preclinical studies, and try to figure out, which of these things are actually useful now? What can we benefit from? What kind of recommendations can be made? What isn't ready? What do we need to watch longer? And we're going to try to kind of distill that down through some of these interviews. So with that said, I don't think we could have a better first guest than Dr. Gary Fraser. Gary Fraser is a practicing cardiologist and a career epidemiologist who has really made some sort of groundbreaking and seminal findings in the field looking at those factors that are associated with health and longevity. So you are probably familiar with some of his work, even if you're not familiar with himself. But if you're familiar with this concept of blue zones, right? These pockets of people throughout the world that seem to have exceptional health outcomes and longevity and lifespan. One of those pockets is the Seventh-day Adventist community in Loma Linda, California. And Gary has been studying this community for several decades and made these seminal findings that really told us that this is, there's something special going on here. And he's done some really amazing and complex work to sort of tease apart the different factors that are driving some of these outcomes and try to understand where the real signal is versus what might be noise. And we'll get into all of that. So with that, welcome, Dr. Gary Fraser. We're super excited to have you. I suppose I should also mention that there's family on the call that, yes, Dr. Gary Fraser and Grant Fraser are related. Grant is Gary's son. So that gives us sort of a unique angle there. And maybe that'll enable Grant to ask you the hard questions I'm not willing to ask. Or maybe it's the opposite. I don't know. We'll see. But thank you so much for being here.
Well, my pleasure, of course. Something like this. It's great to be with you, John and Grant, on maybe one of the first ones of this series. So, a little bit of background, as you requested. As you might detect, I'm from New Zealand originally, lived in Southern California for a long time, and faculty at Loma Linda University in Southern California. That university is a little bit special because the Board of Trustees and so forth are primarily Seventh-day Adventists. It's kind of an Adventist institution, although many of the faculty and many of the students are not, but it gives us an intro to a very special population. And a long time ago, when I was a young doctor and dealing with people who just in the course of their life end up making bad choices that they didn't necessarily know were bad, but it became very clear back in the 60s and 70s when I began my clinical practice that we were spending a lot of time correcting problems that really had no business being there, and were there because people had made suboptimal choices. In other words, prevention seemed to me was a great thing to focus on. So that's what led me into epidemiology, which is really the study and prevention of disease, typically studying whole populations of people. So I was lucky enough in some ways to grow up in an Adventist family in New Zealand, which led me to have an interest in lifestyle and diet, because one of the interesting things about that religion is that Adventists are counseled and advised to prefer a plant-based diet, but it's not required. And so it turns out that about half of them do and half of them don't, at least in the United States. Varies a little bit around the world. And that sets up, to an epidemiologist's mind, a rather wonderful experiment, a natural experiment. So you've got a large number of people, there's about 1 million, and about half of them are some kind of vegetarian, half of them are non-vegetarian. And so you can start asking questions. What is the health experience of these two contrasting groups of people who are very similar in many ways? For instance, they don't smoke. There's very little alcohol consumption. They have typically moderately conservative lifestyle. I mean, they're religious people, but, so many people in the United States are religious people, so that's not particularly special. So that's what really led me into, fortunately, being able to get sizable amounts of money to gather very detailed dietary and other lifestyle data on nearly 100,000 Adventists across the country. So maybe let me stop there and see where you want to go.
Wonderful setup. Yeah, so I guess a couple questions right off the bat. That's a really high ratio of participants, right? I think that you might get the most positive rates of any community. Did you find that are Adventists interested in this science and these sort of outcomes? Do they want to find scientific support for, some of these practices? Or how do you get such a high rate of positive participants?
Well, yeah, that's tough. Well, we figure of the people sitting in the pew, we got about 25%. And we were not really trying to get necessarily a representative group of Adventists. We just wanted to get a population that had a big contrast within the group of the way that they lived, and we established that. And yeah, we had to work with a detailed presentation. We had very persuasive people. We worked with the pastors of several thousand churches across the country, promoted. And these 96,000 people, actually it was, each of them filled out a 50-page questionnaire. So can you imagine that?
Yeah, that's a big ask. That's wonderful.
It's a big ask. Yeah, but a lot of them are interested because they've been living their life in this particular way, many of them, and even the non-vegetarians tend to be relatively health-conscious people in many ways, and we need to bear that in mind. Yeah, we were fortunate, but of course we went into it knowing that the situation that we would probably get a pretty good participation rate, which we did.
Could you share maybe just at a very high level for someone who's new to this research? I know, there's several factors that you've identified as being some of the most protective lifestyle choices that can be made, and they're really held up across multiple cohorts in your research. What are those factors, and what are the kind of key findings there to set us up?
A seminal paper, I suppose, one of the most important reports that I've published was labeled 10 Years of Life Is It a Matter of Choice? And what we found there basically was that the Adventist men, and this was a study in California actually, it was a previous study to the 96,000, it was in a study of 34,000 California Adventists, so we've had two sequential studies. Anyhow, in that study, we found that the men were living about 7.5 years longer than their non-Adventist male neighbors, and the woman about 4.5 years longer than their non-Adventist neighbors. And these were based on thousands and thousands of deaths, and so it was not a chance finding. There was something real going on, and it was obviously pretty important. And interestingly, we found if we dug in a little deeper to the Adventist group, that as you can imagine, that there's a whole variety of compliance with different factors. And we found that, of course, there was some, on average, the men, as I said, were living about 7.5 years longer. But those that were really compliant with the various factors I'm going to mention, they were living more like 10 or 12 years longer. And yet there was others, fortunately a smaller group, that were only getting 2 or 3 years perhaps, or virtually nothing at all. So the factors that we found, one was adhering to some kind of vegetarian diet, and we'll probably want to dig in a bit deeper to that. 2, being careful with your body weight, which is obviously somewhat related to diet. 3, having regular physical activity, which also is a bit related to diet and or body weight again. Then being careful with exercise, and nut consumption was another that was important. And lastly, and an obvious one, never having been a cigarette smoker. And we had about, 20% of our men who maybe started off life not as Adventists who did have that history. So we were able to look into that a little bit as well. But each of those 5 factors that I mentioned seemed, roughly speaking, accounted for a couple of extra years of life. Talked about 10 years of life.
Yeah, that's fantastic. And I think for me, the effect size is striking, right? That 10 years is not a small amount of time. And we have people chasing all of these fancy interventions and off-label prescription drugs and procedures and things that I think, even in an optimistic scenario, we're not even hoping that some of these can get 10 years of life or healthy life. So when you say that these 5 lifestyle factors can combine to generate an outcome like that, and in such a robust study population with so many thousands of participants where, we can really put a lot of faith in this data, I think it's an incredible finding. And the effect size is just striking.
We were very surprised ourselves, to be truthful. Yeah.
But, I'm curious on one item with this, that delta between the males and females is roughly similar to the difference in average longevity between males and females. Did you in any way track couples and see if it's something where that seemed to be that they roughly died at about the same age, as to whether it was something where, the two of them living similarly together ended up resulting in death very close together, unlike the normal, which is most of the time females are going to have several years without their male partner?
Yeah, no, it's a good question, Grant. But we weren't able to do that, unfortunately. In our database, we did not have, apart from looking at second names and addresses, but then we quickly realized sometimes you had children and stuff like that, so it didn't work very well. But I mean, there was a difference there of about 3 years. It turned out, at least at that time when we checked, the average difference between male and female longevity was about 5 years. So we were able to claim, for better or for worse, you were probably stuck with your spouse for an extra couple of years if you were an Adventist.
Very good.
So I'm sure people listening to this, I mean, the natural thing to do with that information, as someone who's interested in their own health and their own lifespan, is to think about, okay, if I adopted these behaviors, am I going to get 10 extra years of life? And naturally, that's not the question that your study asks. So we have to extrapolate a little bit. And I'm just curious, what do you think about that? What's your take on sort of trying to mirror these behaviors to gain something ourselves?
It's a question that we asked ourselves as well. In other words, what would happen if you only made these changes, let's say when you were 50 or 55? What advantage do you get? Now, data is not particularly well set up to look at that in a very accurate way, in the sense that particularly what we call the lacto-ovo vegetarian group, which are those that will have dairy and eggs, but don't have kind of flesh foods, even fish. Most of those had been pretty much lifelong, 30, 40, 50 years in that way. And similarly, the non-vegetarian Adventists, who, by the way, were only eating meat and a lot of it poultry about 3 times a week on average, they also had been almost lifelong in that direction. It was the pesco vegetarians and the strict vegetarians that typically had been adherent to their lifestyle kind of 10 to 20 years on average. So these were relatively long-term adherents, but nevertheless, the difference. So we hardly had enough, even in this large population, to say, okay, let's look at those who only joined the Adventist church, for instance, and then track them and look at their mortality and so forth. And we really haven't done that. And we know that one of the challenges there would be that we would not have a large number of people to study in that. But we could get some clues. For instance, we have looked at mortality rates in many different ways, but one very interesting study we did, I think, was that we could look at a US census population that had been very carefully identified and gathered by the US Census Department and compare their mortality rates and rates from death of different causes to those and our national Adventist population, because I didn't mention it, but these 96,000 people come from every state in the Union. And moreover, the US Census Department did the analysis. So, there wasn't a room for any biases that we might have been, and found that mortality rates overall, if you looked at all cause mortality, were about 35% lower in the Adventists. And so how do you interpret that? It actually means that at every year of age, because that was our time metric, there were 35% fewer Adventists dying in that year of age. And of course, that kind of compounds over the life. But we did find that if we looked only at people who, for instance, were vegetarians or non-vegetarians, that there seemed to be an age differential. There was a difference that was pretty important when people were dying in their 60s and 70s, favoring the vegetarian. But by the time you got to look at deaths in the 80s, that differential between the vegetarian and the still health-conscious non-vegetarian Adventists had largely disappeared. And we may need to come back to that. But it turns out when you dig a bit deeper, you find that age difference in the weakening of the dietary effect seems to particularly affect cardiovascular deaths. Doesn't affect cancer deaths in the same way, and probably some of the other deaths. Now, it also possibly affects neurological deaths, but in a different way, actually in the reverse direction. So, what you can end up saying, I think, is that following a vegetarian lifestyle or something approximating that will deliver many more people into their 80s. Once you get there, you've got to think again a little bit probably not in a major way, but it deserves further study. And that's where we're at now to some extent.
Interesting.
I find it very interesting. One of Walter Longo, he kind of has this delineation with your, what you should do for protein and what you should do for meat. And he thinks that, until you're 60 or 65, lower protein, lower meat. And then once you turn, 65, that then you need a whole bunch more protein and a whole bunch more meat. I haven't dug into the details in regard to, all the science behind that, but it is something where it also ties in. We were going to discuss kind of the study looking at, dementia being diminished by more meat consumption. There's a study that we'll put a link to, and also kind of the discussion about, as you alluded to, the question as to whether particularly vegans, but potentially vegetarians also, have an increased rate of late neurocognitive decline and maybe even late hemorrhagic stroke, as to whether there's something that, individuals who are living this lifestyle might want to consider putting more animal products into their diet as they get older.
Yeah, possibly. It's kind of complicated, Grant. And I mean, I think there's some of those things you talked about are going to prove to be important. But if we look, say, at people who are dying in their 80s and look at all-cause mortality, we're not finding that the vegetarians die more than the non-vegetarians overall. And it turns out that, again, if you dig a little deep, that the death from heart disease, from diabetes, from renal failure, for instance, hypertension, still maintained lower in the vegetarian. But now it looks like it's starting to be counterbalanced by a little higher rate of death in some of these neurological factors that you talked about. And we don't understand, I don't think, just what it is in the diet yet, that if it's real, it's accounting for that. And, maybe it's protein and meat, but as I'm sure you're going to point out, there's some evidence that there's maybe a distinction depending on your genetic. There's these people that have an ApoE4, which is about maybe at least 20% of most European populations. And maybe that's a subgroup that is carrying a especially adverse signal, and that everybody else, still the right thing to adhere to a plant-based diet. And, one other thing I should have said, in that study that compared to the US census population, the rates of mortality in the Adventists Adventists as a whole group were about 30% lower. But if you dig into that, it turns out that it's roughly speaking that the non-vegetarian Adventists are still about 25% lower than the non-Adventists, and the vegetarians are about 35%. So, there's that 25, 30%, but there's a big chunk there, 25%, which is probably largely due to conservative lifestyle and the fact that you're only having 3 servings of meat a week in the non-vegetarian Adventists, but in other ways being a little careful on what you eat. So, it may not be a linear progression of risk.
Yeah, and I just want to contextualize that a little bit for listeners too. We're talking about, in one case, this interaction with ApoE genotype, right? For anyone who's unfamiliar, ApoE is a lipid-handling protein that we all have. There are different isoforms that exist in the population. There's an isoform called ApoE4, like that, as you said, Gary, is present in a substantial portion of the European population, and it's associated with a pretty dramatic increase of Alzheimer's disease, especially at older ages. But this study that we're kind of discussing a little bit, this was an observational study, much smaller numbers than the group you're dealing with. I think they had about 2,000 participants. And what they found in this population was that consumption of meat among individuals that had at least one copy of this ApoE4 allele, it actually seemed to be protective for dementia risk with a pretty impressive hazard ratio around 0.5. And I think that was a surprise for everyone. We have learned a lot about the positive health associations of eating less meat. So seeing something like this that is, moving in the opposite direction and so dependent on this single gene, I think it's an early finding. Obviously, it needs to be validated in other cohorts and other studies, and we need to try to understand what's going on here. But it's exciting, and I think it's really interesting to see studies starting to sort of pull the genetic component into these questions. And, I'm sure as we learn more about the Adventist population and try to understand what might be happening with some of these protective factors, maybe that's something some groups will be picking up too. Gary, I know you mentioned you've started to look at, biochemical profiles in the blood of some of your studies, right? And trying to maybe understand what sorts of multi-omic shifts are driving some of these these outcomes. Could you share a little bit with us on what you're doing there?
Yeah, again, it's early studies. And, just to make a comment to follow up on what you said, I mean, whether it's the meat or what it is, we don't know. And it may turn out not to be the best choice when you hit 80 to suddenly start chowing down on the beef because, that possibly means that the advantage that you would get otherwise in heart disease and kidney failure and diabetes actually disappear. It would be much smarter, I think, if we can decide what it is that's the problem. And, people wonder about some of the fatty acids, perhaps, the long chain or choline, and a number of different things which are important for brain health that you may need to be more careful with as you get older. Maybe your biochemistry is not as efficient. And we know in many instances that that is the case. And so things can change as you get older. But back to your question, and again, I can't answer with specificity. Really, the best I can do at the moment, these are ongoing studies, and for what we've published, that if we compare the metabolic signature, and by that I mean the distribution of about 900 different metabolites in the blood that one can measure on platforms that you can buy. In other words, you get a blood specimen but send it to some lab instead of getting the 10 or 20 things that a doctor might ask. Give you 900 different chemicals that sit in our blood. And we were able to compare that signature in vegans as compared to these still relatively health conscious non-vegetarian Adventists. And to our shock, we found that even making the appropriate statistical adjustments for multiple comparisons and stuff like that, that 600 of the 900 were significantly different.
Wow.
So, what all I can say at the moment is that the fluids that bathe the cells, vegans, are different in many, many ways to those non-vegetarian Adventists, and that's got to have some biological significance, but we haven't really been able to effectively dig into those 600 yet to understand just what all they might mean. And that's one of the challenges with all these omics, that you're dealing with huge numbers.
These are fasted samples, right? I'm assuming. I think that's really important for people to understand, because I think when we think about how these dietary choices, impact health outcomes, it's tempting to just think it's a simple relationship between consumption of different compounds that act on different pathways, and it's, very straightforward. But I think what that suggests, if what I'm understanding is correct, if you're seeing these dramatic shifts in the composition of blood in the fasted state between a vegan and someone who consumes meat, I guess that reflects very wide shifts in overall metabolism and, the resting state of different pathways and products being secreted by the liver and muscle, I'm sure. And I think that's incredibly interesting and really puts a different spin maybe on how we think about how consumption of different things drives outcomes.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. And we're also just beginning studies to look at DNA methylation differences. That's kind of a form of epigenetics, and also finding, thousands of different chemicals, thousands of different methylation sites. And you may want to say more about that, John, I don't know. But, we start off dealing with 800,000 different methylation sites, and we get thousands where they're different, and that controls the expression of genes.
Do you see differences in epigenetic age between your groups?
We haven't really done that very effectively, right? And we will get to that. I'm actually writing a grant application with that somewhat in mind now to develop that, because we suspect that some of kind of the existing instruments probably will need a little bit of amending to deal with the social population.
Do you find any differences specifically in regard to the substitutions of what people do, as to whether you have meat eaters that are still having a similar amount of fruits and vegetables and doing just as many healthy things as your non-meat eaters, and as to whether that yields similar health outcomes, versus if there's, a lot of times you eat meat and as a result of it you end up getting less of good things, versus versus if somebody is eating meat and they're still doing all of the good things in the same quantity. I think that there was some study that you'd done that looked at kind of big harm of meat was more the loss of the healthy things that would have taken its place.
Yeah, I mean, you raise a good point that it's always the case when you look at a dietary change or the effect of having or not having a particular dietary item, you've got to say as compared to what. In other words, what goes in place, because the body tends to conserve calories. So if you knock something out or put something in, something else is being substituted or deleted. And it's often not clear, and even some published papers, what's the comparison group? I mean, it's not like cigarette smoking where you can either do it or you don't, but we've all got to eat. And so it's a little different. So that's a good point. We've only looked at, to answer your question directly, Grant, at done actual substitution analyses, which one can do in 2 or 3 somewhat limited situations, specifically where we were looking at dairy as composed to plant-based substitutes for dairy. And this was with respect to colorectal cancer and breast cancer and prostate cancer, which are the 3 most common cancers, actually, apart from skin cancer in our communities. And it was interesting there because there'd been quite a lot of work that, particularly with respect to breast cancer and prostate cancer, which are hormone-dependent cancers, that soy consumption, given that it's a phytoestrogen, in other words, it's got a weak plant-based estrogen in there, was potentially protective for these cancers, prostate and breast cancer. And what we found, to our surprise, because nearly all the published papers, when looking at the soy products, had not taken account of concurrent use of dairy products. And so we could look at both, because we had a lot of people who would have soy products, but also have a bit of dairy milk or cheese or other things. To our surprise, what we found, in our data at least, is that soy consumption is actually a relative marker for the absence of dairy. And so those that were eating more soy were at lower risk. But when we put dairy in the equation, the soy effect dropped out and the hazardous effects of dairy milk came to the fore. And, that was kind of interesting. And some studies have actually been along the same lines with prostate cancer, not so much with breast cancer. But, these were not trivial findings. We were finding 50% increases in people that were drinking only, over long periods of time, 3/4 of a cup a day of milk, for instance. And there are a lot of bovine sex hormones. Well, not a lot. There's enough there that over a long period of time could conceivably have made it. So, that's kind of the substitution kind of thing. One other thing that may be a little bit along the lines of your question, Grant, is that we did do some analyses where we looked at the degree of processing of foods that were being eaten. And we took about 40 different food groups and divided various items within those groups into whether they were highly processed, medium processed, or relatively unprocessed, and developed scores. And we found that people who diet contained a lot of processed foods had a 15 to 20% higher mortality rate. And the interesting thing was, that gets a little bit at your question, we could ask that question separately in vegetarians and non-vegetarians. And somewhat to our surprise, we found it didn't make any difference. The vegetarians who ate a lot of processed vegetarian foods still had that extra 15 to 20% of risk, very similar to the non-vegetarians.
I think that brings up a really important point, because if someone was looking at adopting a vegetarian diet or eating less meat, and they substituted that meat with a highly processed veggie burger in the freezer aisle at the grocery store, or any number of these vegetarian foods that are highly processed, there's a lot, right? You could eat an entirely vegetarian diet only of processed foods. That would potentially be a bad thing, right? Can you generalize on the Adventist population and say whether are the vegetarians, do you think they're eating more of a whole food based diet than maybe some other vegetarian populations, or do you see a pretty broad spread even within the Adventists?
A pretty broad spread, I think. We actually have some pretty good data on that, possibly the best data in the world on commercial vegetarian product use, which is fairly widespread, I would say, particularly in the lacto-ovo vegetarians, which are about 60% of 60-70% actually of our vegetarian population. And in fact, Adventists have a long history of commercial enterprises that have made such foods. Mm-hmm. And the Adventist believers have tended to use them, but it's far from uniform. And particularly over the last few years, there has been a growing realization that there's a question mark over these highly processed foods. And you can get veggie burgers and garden burgers and things like that, which have a mix of products, but they're pretty natural. And so, you do have some choices, even some nut products they're not really very highly processed. And we find, particularly amongst the strict vegetarians, which are about 9 or 10% of our group, we call them vegans. We've got the largest data set by far of vegans because that's about 8,000 people. There's a large subgroup of those, probably the majority, who probably don't eat very much of these commercial foods and tend to do a lot of food preparation themselves in a very common natural form. So there's a lot of variation.
Yeah, as expected. Before we move on from the milk thing too, I just want to clarify, because I'm sure that caught some people's attention. It sounds like this is just drinking milk, right? That this isn't necessarily something that holds true across other forms of dairy like yogurt and cheese. And is that correct?
Yeah, good question. Let me just back off a little bit. Our data was very strong, and it's not something that we can easily explain away, the effect that we saw on both breast and prostate cancers independently. One was a man and one was a woman. They weren't the same populations, obviously. Yep. And we also found that it was not linear. What do I mean by that? What we found, to our surprise, and we looked at it very carefully, was that there was a rapid rise in risk currently in our data between zero milk, and in our population, we had many, many more zero milk drinkers than most other populations, or very low milk consumers. But there was this rapid rise between almost none or none and about 2/3 of a cup a day. And after that, the risk stayed high, but tended to level off. So there was kind of almost a cliff there.
Sounds like a drug.
Well, exactly. I mean, it seems like maybe we're saturating some biochemical pathway or something of that sort.
Yeah.
But, this is relatively unique data. As I said, there are some other studies that would support something like this for prostate cancer. It's a fairly unique result for breast cancer. But having said that, there's very, very few studies that have been able to look as carefully as we could at that very low level of intake, where we find most of the biology is happening. So what I tell people is say, there's some uncertainty there yet, but if you have a bad family history of breast or prostate cancer, you might want to be careful about that. There's some pretty good plant milks out there. And to your question, we were able to look separately at yogurt and cheese and did not find a strong adverse signature. And you can interpret that in different ways, but if in fact the sex hormone thing is relevant, you can claim, and there's evidence in fact, that those chemicals tend to get somewhat denatured with the preparation of the.
So to recap, if we're talking about, specific dietary factors, you've mentioned the dairy piece, right? Having zero dairy, because even a small amount seems to really start you on that steep increase in risk, if that data proves to be correct. Eating less processed foods, I guess, is the other piece you brought up, because that seems to be important even within vegetarians. If you are eating less processed vegetarian products versus more, that seems to be protective. And you also mentioned more nuts right up front as one of the sort of key 5 factors that found in the original cohort. Is it fair to say that these are the 3 sort of strongest associations or most important diet takeaways that people should take from your work?
3, yeah.
I guess I forgot to even mention the meat. Of course, the vegetarian aspect too, so 4.
And we have done some work looking particularly at red meat. We've never seen an adverse signal of poultry by itself. On the other hand, as Grant was saying before, that inevitably displaces other relatively high-calorie foods or other vegetarian products potentially that could be protective that you'd then be missing out on. But the red meat, there's a strong signal for that. And of course, that's well recognized, particularly for a risk of colorectal cancer and for insulin resistance and diabetes risk particularly, and probably for certain cancers as well. And we haven't really talked much about cancer. We could come back but I think they're the factors we've looked at. I'm currently looking very carefully at stroke and looking at different fatty acids and that. Probably a little early to comment on that.
I think people might be surprised. At least I was when I, read these in some of your papers. I think so often we see so much focus on leafy green vegetables and high fiber. And I'm sure you'll tell us that those are still good things, right? And probably part of the protective benefit of a plant-based diet. But it sounds like some other things rose to the top in terms of the signals you were seeing versus maybe what gets the most attention.
Well, it is interesting. We have looked a little bit at the leafy green vegetables and some of the other individual vegetables. And, one needs to recognize that the diet is so complicated, hundreds of different food items at least. To single out one or even one class of those foods is a tough ask, actually, to be sure that the signal is coming from that and not from something else that is perhaps correlated with it that you haven't taken account of. But you're right that there's nothing that has jumped out at us in terms of the green leafy vegetables. And, people talk about colored vegetables and various kind of cyclical chemicals that are in there of many different sorts, flavonoids and so forth. We've not finished looking by a long way. And in fact, one of the things that I tend to do that you would understand, Don, particularly, is to apply the high dimensional process to the 200 or 300 phytochemicals that we have data on in our database, and just do a mining look, if you like, but use the right statistic. What about out of those 200 or 300 chemicals, there's stuff that nobody's ever thought of to look at in terms of relation to these diseases? So I think, that's where we're at, despite the fact you can talk about 40, 50 years of nutritional studies. There's still a huge amount not known, more than what we do know.
Curious as far as other things that you think may go into increased longevity. And I guess my view, it kind of slower aging, because it is something where it seems as though Adventists are pushing off those fatal and disabling diagnoses by a similar number of years. So in my view, they're aging more slowly. But what other factors do you think are unique to the population that have been looked at as far as things like education, income, other socioeconomic markers, even chemical exposures that they may be getting that might be different and beneficial beyond just diet?
So are there factors that go along with the diet? For instance, are the vegetarians different in other ways apart from what they eat, and Adventists different in other ways apart from what they eat when you compare them with the census population? The answer to that is obviously yes. In the comparison with the census population, for instance, there was limits to what we could adjust for, because in the census population, they had kind of limited data. But interestingly, we could adjust for education, and that was relatively important because our 96,000 people, although they covered the whole spectrum of education, there was a tendency towards quite well-educated people. So we took care of education, we adjusted for that and that comparison with the census. We also knocked out anybody from the census population that was a current smoker, and we were able to adjust carefully for past smoking habits in both groups. So we think we took care of that as well, and we still found these big differences, 30%, and I could delve into that more. But I don't think education is a key factor or necessarily socioeconomic status. Having said that, those things I think probably act primarily in the general population, and also to some extent in our population, by prompting better choices. People have, one, better knowledge of what they should be doing, and two, probably more flexibility in their lifestyles and the amount of other issues and problems going on that they have to deal with in a person who's perhaps in a lower socioeconomic group. So, we were able to adjust for that, and it did not take things away. The other category of differences that one surely has to think about is the fact that these were all, by definition, quotes, religious people, although there was a wide variety of beliefs and adherents within that group, as you might imagine. So we did have a sub-study actually of about 11,000 people that filled out an additional questionnaire that focused on both beliefs and adherence. And we're able to look at that quite carefully. And again, I think we found evidence that the people that were more adherent religiously did tend to be more so of those who adhered to the plant-based lifestyle. That was also one of the recommendations of the church, of course. That didn't account for everything. And if you tried to isolate the religion factor alone, we did not find any strong associations with physical health, but we found repeatedly quite strong associations with mental health in terms of less depressive feelings, depending particularly on your perception of God, to kind of express it simply, if you thought he was an ogre who was supervising and about to zap you anytime you did something wrong, as compared to thinking of a God who was helpful and benign and loving. And that seemed to make quite a difference in mental health. But that was the main takeaway from our look at religiosity as a entity in itself.
Did you also, perhaps you looked at this, but the people who maybe had these more deeply held religious convictions and better mental health, were they participating more in the church and getting more social support? And do you think that could be part of that equation too? Or does it seem to be independent from that?
We were able to adjust for that, and I've no doubt that that's an important issue. But again, I think, in fact, you could kind of draw causality from social support enables one to be a more effective vegetarian, which in turn changes your physical health, because it is true that there are certain skills to be taught. There are forces out there, both commercial and otherwise, that would tend not to favor a vegetarian lifestyle. So the kind of support you get psychologically within the group really is important in that way. But I would argue that it largely operates through the ability to maintain the choices.
That's interesting that your view at this point is that a lot of the factors that some people put into longevity, including community, exercise, sleep, other social engagement, socioeconomic status, these types of things probably are significantly subservient to what your diet is, would be what I'm hearing from you.
Well, I don't want to overstate that, because I think that if you look at studies that have really focused primarily on those social factors, the strength of the relationships with mortality are pretty strong. So I think I would probably argue a little bit that, what I've said, I think accounts for a substantial part of that, but there's probably stuff beyond that that may operate through the stress pathways.
So I want to make sure we at least touch on a couple of the other key factors you mentioned at the beginning. I think we've done, good coverage of diet, really gotten into some of the details there. You've touched on BMI a little bit, which of course is closely linked to diet, right? And maintaining healthy weight is obviously important for a number of reasons. We talked about nut consumption, standing out as this, very special component of diet that seems to have a large effect. Not smoking, I don't think we need to spend a lot of time there, right? Everybody's going to believe us right away. The other one is exercise, and it sounds like it's a protective factor. Could you help us understand, what you've learned about the type and the intensity and the duration of exercise that seems to be optimal?
Yeah, for an epidemiologist, that's something that comes up all the time, of course, and something that we nearly always put into our equations as a covariate. In other words, we adjust for the effects of exercise. But in my view, it's a very tough one to look at unless you're able to do a randomized controlled trial. And there's a number of those out there. And what I mean by that is that you take a group of people, and most of these are done in people that already have some physical disability. For instance, they have heart disease, or they're cancer, recovering from cancer, or they have Alzheimer's or something like that. And so you can randomly divide them into two groups without any biases to who sits in which group, and give one group a lot of exercise counseling and not the other, then follow them up and see what happens. So the stuff like that. And there's pretty good evidence that, cardiac rehabilitation, for instance, is along those lines. It's helpful. A little bit of evidence, not very strong, at least as I read it, that in Alzheimer's disease, it probably is a little bit helpful. Some evidence in cancer survivors that it can be helpful, at least psychologically, and maybe in some cases in recurrence. But it's a really tough ask to ask that question in terms of total mortality. So you can't really do a randomized trial, because you have to identify a large number of people, randomly allocate them, and then wait till they die and expect for the next 20 years that they're going to adhere to an exercise program or not. So you're stuck with observational studies and that particular question to a large extent. And there's a big problem there. It's a chicken and egg problem. In other words, the people who self-choose to be exercisers and perhaps have better VO2 max and things like that, their physiology is a little different. You can't really decide whether that's because they are genetically or for some other reason healthier anyhow. And therefore, inevitably, they're going to live long. And they exercise, but what is causing what? And in observational studies, that's a very hard one to unpack. Randomized controlled trials can do it, but if you're looking at all-cause mortality and survival, that's a very tough study to undertake. So I think one can say that if you look at risk factors, yeah, physical activity is probably definitely helpful for insulin sensitivity. I think some evidence that it might be beneficial in protection against onset of diabetes. There's some evidence that it tends to lower blood pressure a little bit, but again, it's a relatively acute effect. You stop exercising, and a few weeks later, the effect has gone. There's some evidence that it's beneficial in maybe having a lower risk of certain cancers, a number of cancers. Colorectal and in some studies prostate and a variety of others. The effects are relatively small. So, the chances are that it is helpful, at least in a relatively acute sense. But once you stop, I think things tend to reverse. Although if you've been an exerciser for 20 or 30 years, it's hard not to think that benefit you got there does linger on even to the later years. But so, I think it's helpful. And certainly in terms of maintaining a good body weight, I think diet everyone would agree now, is number one for that. But added to it with exercise is even more beneficial. So, I'm speaking in favor of exercise, but I think that from a researcher's perspective, it's a tough one to look at in terms of all-cause mortality.
Makes sense.
Okay, do we want to wrap things up a little bit and maybe summarize what have your dad go through and summarize, if you had to, if you had people who aren't Adventists, what would be the main things that somebody could do to potentially prolong their life if you had to just give them a punch list? I know we've kind of gone through it a little bit, but if as far as what your findings have been over the years, if you had to give somebody 5 or 6 things that they should do.
Yeah, the ones working with patients, as you and I do, one thing you realize is that even a list of 5 or 6 sometimes is pretty hard for people to retain and act on. And certainly if we go in that direction, we can talk about preferring a plant-based diet, and particularly red meat being a bad guy for cardiovascular disease. Nuts are helpful. Be a little cautious, particularly about dairy, milk. And then there's the question of processed foods. If I wanted to simplify it even further, I think I would say prefer a plant-based diet, trend substantially in that direction. Remember that even our non-Adventists were not really technically plant-based, but they'd made some substantial changes and they got big benefits. So you don't have to go the whole way necessarily, although by all means do so if you can. I'm not sure, but we haven't talked about it, by the way, but I'm not sure that vegan is the way to go. If I had to make a recommendation there, I would probably, and our data support this, pesco vegetarian might be your best choice. Limited dairy, maybe some cheese and yogurt. I'd go a little slow on the dairy milk, and some fish apparently seems to be helpful. When we look at the different kinds of vegetarians in our data, it's the pesco vegetarians that seem to do best of all. The others are doing quite well, but they do best. So plant-based diet, a little bit of fish, and be careful about too much processed food. And in terms of the diet, I'd just leave it really at those 3. That'll take you a fair way in the right direction, I think.
I just have 2 small follow-ups. How much is a little fish? Are we talking like once or twice a week, or what seems to be a protective or helpful amount?
Yes, there would be very few of our people that had it more than twice a week. So, and many of them less than that, to be truthful. And, the whole question of fish and chronic disease is still somewhat controversial. I mean, for a long while, we thought it was protective against coronary heart disease and sudden death and so forth. And then the data really came and didn't look so supportive. And of course, whole society changes over 30 or 40 years when you're looking at the same item. It's in a different context many times. So it's a little unclear about that. There's some reason to think that limited fish consumption might be helpful for neurologic disease. Not a lot of objective support for that. Notice this, DHA, which is one of the long-chain omega-3 fatty acid, is far and away the greatest fat constituent of the brain, and it's involved structurally but also functionally up there. And yet, if you're a strict vegetarian, and to some extent even a lacto-ovo vegetarian, your dietary consumption of DHA is 0 to minimal amounts you might get in some eggs that have small amounts. So, you can put together stories like this. Whether they're going to hold up course of time, I don't know, but it's a story that kind of makes some sense. I would say I would be on 1 or 2 times a week myself.
Well, you bring up a good point there too, that, it's not just epidemiology that's pointing us in this direction too, right? There's now a broad body of biochemical research and cell biology that supports a lot of these same recommendations. And I think it's really exciting that we're starting to understand some of the why behind the effect, and being able to, if we can understand it more deeply, sometimes those recommendations can get a little bit more precise too, right? So I think the omega-3 acids in fish fatty acids in fish is a great example of that. But okay, I've got my notes, I've got my recommendations. I think it's pretty clear what the data's telling us here, and I just want to say thank you so much, Gary, for being here and for doing this important work and being the voice that you've long been for this kind of research and for the things that you're finding. I think it can't be understated just how impactful this is for people like us that care about this stuff. So thank you very much.